Let's go.
So on the, there's a great Bible passage, I think Romans 12:2 for the kids with their cartoon that they're watching that says, do not be anxious about anything, but in every situation present your request to God. So it's about anxiety. So I think that's a great quote to go with Frida Kahlo, because as I mentioned last week, her work, even though it's not at all conspicuously religious, I think you'll see underlying it is a kind of desire to connect to something, because a lot of her life is characterized by pain and suffering, and I think anxiety related to that, not just physical suffering, although I think that's the chief suffering she's experienced, is also just the adversities of life, relationships and all that, particularly her relationship to her philandering husband. She does get a little bit of payback against him for that, because she makes that a kind of central subject of her artwork, but not, I think, as a vengeful way so much as just a way of saying, I'm going to use this canvas for personal purposes as my place to really kind of revitalize in the face of all of life's adversities. So it's not, I think, a vindictive thing so much as just like a direct conduit between her and kind of a need to kind of use art to keep herself together in the face of all the kinds of suffering she's experiencing. She's also really interesting kind of ground level view of Mexican society. And we're not going to go in depth into the Mexican Revolution until we get to Diego Rivera, but we're going to get our feet wet, because you really can't talk about Frida Kahlo without talking about Mexico, and especially talking about Diego Rivera, her husband. And I think she gives you a good kind of window into that the tension in Mexico between having to choose one or the other. We kind of went into that last week, but I'll go more in depth into that. Now, some of her work is probably hard for some people to look at. I don't think you guys will have a problem, maybe younger people might, but that's just because I think she's so bold about really making her own suffering, like her miscarriage and things like that, really the center of her artwork. And I think it's really, will be the interesting question for us to ask is how much of her artwork leans on Catholicism, and I mean that kind of generally, not so much literally visualizing scenes from the Bible, so much as using that Catholic tradition of using artwork to visualize stories, visualize suffering, and as a way to express your kind of connection to a higher power. Now, in her case, she's a product of her time, and so, of course, in the early 20th century, there's a lot of changes going on, modernization in Mexico, and so she's definitely subject to forces that we all are familiar with the 20th century, but she offers a really interesting counterpoint to the Diego Rivera view that we're going to see next week, because her work is much more personal, much more private, much more intimate, and not about kind of tackling history or tackling public spaces so much as personal, private spaces, small, not mural, but that's why it's so useful to look at her work, because she's a really interesting kind of parallel trajectory to the muralist movement, which is much more big and spectacular. And she, I think, gives you a view of kind of Diego Rivera's travels around the United States in the 1930s from her perspective. And so, of course, remember next week we're going to look at Diego Rivera, and that will kind of flesh out some of the blanks that we're leaving today. Any questions so far? Everyone doing okay? Nice to see you all. Any observations immediately about what you see here? Either the writing or the visuals behind her? Any comments about her or her lifespan or name or anything stand out to you?
She didn't look very long.
What's that? That's what stands out to me for sure. I'm right around her age now, so I'm definitely like, wow, that's interesting. I remember when I was Jim Morrison's age. Now I'm Frida Kahlo's age. 27. Anyway, so yeah, she lived how long? Anyone want to do the math for me?
48.
Like 40, late 40s, right? And I'd say that's a pretty, not a life unlived, but certainly a life cut short. And I think that really has a lot to do with the personal suffering she went through. She had a bus accident when she was a young woman that really impacted her physically, and would mean possibly not being able to have children. And I think it's a little different question to ask now, when a lot of people are just kind of can't afford to have kids, or whatever it may be the reason. But back then it was much more of a burden to come to terms with not having children. And in her case, I think she really wanted children, and she would be the first to tell you that in many ways her paintings were a substitute for not being able to have children. So keep in mind that even though she's definitely not what I would say a very traditional woman in any sense, it's really because I think she's a person of her time, and also was dealing with so many personal, physical issues that really kind of had to recalibrate her life according to kind of different standards. And as an artist, many artists often kind of live lives that are somewhat, less traditional perhaps. But I think there's a yearning for something that is kind of in her work that almost feels like, Catholicism seems to be something that gives her some kind of guidance in her paintings. And I think you'll see that, even though I think she's someone who would say that she's not, so she struggles with religion like I think a lot of some people do maybe in an age when you're undergoing a transformation from, rural to urban, traditional and modern. And in her case, on top of all that, you have Mexico's tension between indigenous and Catholic, and I think that's really essential to understanding her. We went over that briefly last week with this painting here being really, I think, one of her most important and famous paintings. And she's dividing herself into two to capture that division. So when you think of division in Mexico, what kinds of, I know we're not, you're not experts on Mexico, but I think we kind of got a little bit into it to start thinking like, what divisions are in Mexico? Like you might think in the United States, divisions between like race perhaps, and maybe gender, and for certainly blue and red. So where are the divisions in Mexico?
First thing, because with you speaking, that she was deeply involved with Catholicism, and in that picture before, she looks like she is holding an ancient Aztec.
Great.
And so she's torn between the Catholicism that the Spanish brought and her deep roots culturally.
Yeah, and I think that's very well said. And I think, especially in this time period, someone, before the late 1900s, or late 1800s, early 1900s, there wasn't really that tension because anything Aztec was really reviled and kind of erased or marginalized. And then suddenly, in the late 1900s, and we'll go more into this when we get to the Mexican Revolution. In the late 1800s, Mexico starts kind of reckoning with its history, and she certainly comes of age in that time, so she really has to struggle. And it's not like you can say at this point, oh, indigenous and Catholic, they totally, they're kind of oil and vinegar. And so whether it's a matter of her reconciling the two, I think that's what's part of what's going on. And so yeah, indigenous and Catholic is certainly one part of it. Another?
The first thing that comes to mind too with like Mexican and a lot of Latin cultures is gender role.
Right.
Division of the gender is very strict.
Yeah, absolutely. So you'll find that, I think that really comes to light with issues like having children, with Diego Rivera, finding some kind of sense of balance between traditional and modern, certainly with her relationship with Diego Rivera. And I think generally just being modern means kind of having to figure out, where does your professional life end and your personal life begin kind of thing. And it's something I think we all struggle with. That's why I think it's so universal, even though it's, I think, specific to Mexico, in her case. I think we can all kind of universalize this. We all have a kind of internal struggle, but I think we have to recognize in her case, it's a little bit hard to, it's almost like either or. There's no kind of balance between the two, and I think that's what makes it really hard. Now keep in mind, we'll also look at this again, and after we look at it learn a little bit more about her, you'll realize that this also has very much to do with her relationship with Diego Rivera and how she first herself sees him as kind of central to her identity as a person, how she dresses as a way to kind of please him. This is called the Tijuana outfit that she wore. So dressing in the indigenous way was a way of affirming her indigenous side, which was a way of kind of winning over his affections, and him being a card-carrying communist and definitely on the side of indigenous, people protecting the indigenous. You really can't have that and say, well, I'm on the side of the Catholic Church, because at this point in time there's a real tension between the two right in the wake of the Mexican Revolution. Now the Catholic Church, I think, still very powerful in Mexico, but you just have to understand, if you're looking at it from the indigenous perspective, you might tend to see some kind of like, this institution is against the indigenous people. Now I don't think it is completely, but I think that's part of the nature of the tension that's going on with Frida Kahlo. Now she has an interesting relationship with her mother and father. Her father's German, and her mother's a blend of indigenous and European. So she's kind of already a hybrid person, and kind of already tension, I think, between the two. I think the mom is on more the traditional Catholic side, and her father is much more kind of a modern German, kind of probably less traditional. And so there's already that tension in their family. And this is her and Diego Rivera. And I show these two because of the transformation in one decade that really goes on. What do you, when I say a transformation, what do you notice? Obviously, hopefully you see these are two different paintings. What do you think I'm kind of pointing out here with this transformation? Well, one, he's gone, right? Sorry.
Yeah. And just looking at the picture of them as a couple, she seems very small. I don't know if that's indication of their relationship or her stature.
Yeah, both. I mean, literally, she was very small. I think he called himself like the frog and the dove. She was the dove, he was the frog.
She, on the right-hand side, is very much, she was, that look, I'm in charge, I'm to be reckoned with.
Yeah, very good. I think that's exactly right. That she's kind of the doting wife here, kind of leaning into him, holding his hand. And here you don't even see him at all. So we'll kind of chronicle what leads from this to that. And even substituting him with, parrot and that butterfly. The way the background kind of seems to add another layer of meaning to the picture. And even her painting, I mean, I think even her painting gets a lot better. And that's one thing I really like about her as an artist. I like artists who you really see them struggle and transform as they work rather than just hitting the ground running. It just is, for me personally, I like seeing artists struggle.
I also like how in the one on the left, the colors is more in the foreground, but then on the one on the right where it's her self-portrait, she's in all black, and she uses the green like to frame herself. And I'm assuming Benito is the parrot.
Yeah, interesting. That's a really great observation. Yeah, the colors, the colors are kind of surrounding her body here, whereas she's kind of subdued her colors, the colors are now kind of, yeah, that's a very interesting observation.
And she's got the caterpillars and the butterfly, so
all right,
it's like
so
she's categorizing her own transformation
great. No, that's
in
great.
the painting.
Really great. Yeah, I think you're gonna keep all that up because I think you'll really find all those little subtle ways of analyzing her work will really bear a lot of fruit, especially when we look more of her work from this period, after here, because really she's obviously adding a lot more meaning to stuff where it's kind of just being kind of illustrated here. But what a great contrast between the two, right?
Do you know what the banner says that the dove
Yes,
is
I can't remember offhand, but yeah, it will be something referring to like the love between them. I just can't remember in this case what it said. You can look it up, it'll definitely be fine.
What's with the brushes and the palette?
So he's a painter,
He's
this is her
a
husband, he's a
American
painter too.
flag.
So that's just him being a painter, I think.
It's not an American flag?
Oh
It's
yeah,
in
great.
the-
Yeah, I
it's
don't
in
think
the-
so. I don't think there's a reference to that, but that might just be a kind of accidental, it just kind of looks like, kind of red, white, and blue. I definitely don't think Diego
I think
Rivera would
it's,
have intentionally, but anyway.
It looks like the handles are silver,
So-
and then the brush stems are like a brown, kind of, I think is what it
Yeah, but that's
what
an
it is.
interesting looking at kind of
Yeah.
unexpected foreshadowing of his controversy with the United States.
Yeah.
Any comment over here, or do you guys have something to say over there? Yeah, so remember, when we get to Diego Rivera, he knows that he's playing a game of cat and mouse when he comes to the United States. He's sort of being used as a pawn in this bigger game of, United States-Mexico relationships, which we'll go more into again next week. So that's an interesting observation that there could be kind of a sense that she's referencing the fact that he's kind of potentially a sellout at this point because he's, has to be true. And he definitely has to walk that line between the people in Mexico saying you're a sellout and the people in the United States saying, oh, we love you. And he likes to be loved, like many people do. But then, of course, when he goes back to Mexico, all the communists or all the anti-US people might say, oh, you've sold out. So he's well aware of walking that fine line. And here is some early pictures of Frida Kahlo. On the left, can you spot Frida Kahlo? She might be a little hard to spot. She's not really dressed like you might expect. And that, I think, speaks to her kind of being a little bit of a quirky character.
I found what the banner says.
Yeah, there she is on the left here. Wearing, and I don't know why she wore. This is her sister, by the way. She'll come up. This is her sister Christina, and this is a picture of her mom's family. I think this is her mom. Oh, this is mom here. So very traditional kind of indigenous clothing there on the mom's side. And the father is the one taking the picture. Her father was a photographer and very supportive of his daughter using photography. And the father is definitely, I think, a big hero of the story because when she does have her bus accident, the father gives her a camera and paintbrushes, and she starts discovering artwork as a way to heal after her accident. But I think you already see, I know a lot of artists, and definitely, I wouldn't be surprised if a lot of them have a picture from their childhood where they're dressed in drag or something. It's like dressing up, playing different costumes. I think we've already seen that, where she's, her appearance is very central to kind of her identity. So,
I did find what banner says.
Oh, yeah, please.
So in Spanish, it's aquí nos ves a mí, Frida Kahlo, junto con mi amado esposo Diego Rivera. Pinte esos retratos en la bella ciudad de Francisco, blah, blah, blah. Basically, here you see us, me, Frida Kahlo, with my dearest husband, Diego Rivera. I painted these pictures in the delightful city of San Francisco, California, for our companion, Mr. Albert Bender, and it was in the month of April of the year 1931. So it's like a description.
Yeah, and we'll see a lot
painting.
more writing on her work, and I think that is another thing that adds
That's
a little.
pretty cool. She like timestamps it.
Yeah, oh yeah, absolutely. And you'll see that throughout her work today, that she does a lot of that. And it adds just another layer of kind of left brain, right brain to her work that I think is really neat. And it's very personal, shows how personalized her work is. He would never do that because most of his work is about history and it's not about, time stamping where and when he was. So good, I'm glad you looked that up. And yeah, again, early photos, and I think the masquerade, the costuming, the importance of clothing as part of identity. Because you see this later in her career. This is after Diego Rivera, and she got divorced, and she's dressed up in a suit again. She's cut off all her hair, and it says, "Mira que si te quise fue por el pelo." Look, if I wanted you, it was for your hair. Ahora que estás pelona, ya no te. And now that your hair's cut off, I don't love you. And so she's sort of, again, making the costume, dressing up like Diego. And, Samson with his hair cut off. Samson's hair was a source of his power. And in her case, certainly her hair is an important element of her power.
I think part of beauty and spirit.
Yeah, beauty, spirit, identity, the individuality, absolutely. So these are some themes that come up in her life. I think the ones we're going to focus on today are really the suffering and love, and of course her Mexican identity. So she had polio as a child, and one leg was shorter than the other. And so one reason for a lot of the costuming is the kind of concealing, and she would, I'm not, inventing this, is something she would, very be happy to admit that, a lot of her, was, she wouldn't smile a lot in her pictures, and some people say, well, that's because she's very stoic. Well, other people might say, well, that's because she was a chain smoker, and she didn't want to, you don't see her, like, yellow teeth. It's kind of like you have to decide how much of it is kind of masquerade, how much is sort of, putting on a show, how much is just sort of costuming for costuming's sake. And a lot of that kind of has to be understood as like, well, how much is this her affirming her Mexican identity, her own, individual identity, not making it dependent on her husband's love. And of course, a photograph of her is very different than a portrait, a self-portrait. They're kind of the same thing, but when the artist paints her own portrait, it's very different. So here's one of her earliest paintings early on, and really, I think it goes to show her interest in portraiture and just human beings. And I think this is a self-portrait in this case. This is before her accident. Looked very young here, and what a transformation from 1922 to 1926. Really kind of grows up, and you notice she's really still focused on the face, and the rest of the kind of painting doesn't quite have the same treatment. And then she has this bus accident where basically she gets impaled by a piece of rebar, the equivalent of that, and it ruptures her pelvis and leaves her in bed for many months, if not, I think, maybe even a year or more. And there's a lot of doubt about whether or not, one, she'll be able to live a normal life, be able to have children. It definitely is a real challenge to walk already, with one leg being shorter due to polio, and now, adding kind of insult to agony here, all the added pain, and really leaves her bedridden for many months. And so these are drawings that she does of her accident, and this is really, I think, when she really fully starts embracing art as her real sort of calling in life. So this is a rare instance of her painting her accident, and this is her channeling some of this tradition in Mexico called ex voto paintings, where you hire someone to paint what happened to you, kind of whether it's a miscarriage or shipwreck or an accident or death of a loved one or a fire. And I think it's so interesting to us because of the Protestant Revolution, going back to Martin Luther and last summer, you had Protestantism kind of reject artwork and that's not reject it, but it became obsolete because now you could read the Bible. You didn't need those pictures anymore. And sadly, that means maybe in a lot of the history of art, especially in the United States, there's kind of a you jump from kind of the Renaissance to like the 20th century, because you don't really know what art is until kind of the 20th century as things change, and we don't have that Catholic tradition of painting anymore because Protestantism and Catholicism kind of broke, ruptured, at least in terms of the importance of art as part of the religious experience. Whereas here in Frida Kahlo's case, she's still channeling this Catholic tradition of painting, and it's very much tied up in religion. So I think that's what makes her work so neat, and that's why I think even the writing that she adds is still kind of like something that you would see from these ex voto paintings. So it's kind of like it's almost like a folk art quality to her work that I see with the Catholicism. So big transformation. This is almost her more European here, and there's you can see a little more of the indigenous side. And the unibrow is very interesting. I think when you think about how her appearance starts, also how she starts reevaluating her appearance when she comes to the United States, right? Because a lot of people in the United States might bleach certain parts of their body and want to conform, whereas I think her experience in the United States made her want to affirm her unique kind of Mexican appearance, and that unibrow is like a kind of personal statement, and that she's kind of affirming her identity. But I think what's so neat about her early work is you see a lot of interest in the people surrounding her, and that also reveals a lot about Mexico and the importance of like a constellation of people around you, because these paintings were done after her bus accident, and you really see all the people, her sister, I think the midwife, maybe the children, and painting people in a way that, now today if you painted people, they'd all be on their smartphone, so it's like, we don't, I used to do drawings of people in New York, and all my drawings, like, not one person was on their phone, and now if you did it, it would just be drawings of people on their phone, because that's life today. And I think even back then, though, before smartphones, in Mexico, people were very valuable, whereas in the United States, you have a much more industrial society without the important kind of monolithic religion keeping everyone together. And so it's just a different world. And so when she goes to the United States with Diego Rivera in 1930, 31, she really gets a kind of a fish out of water experience in the United States. Very long neck there.
What kind of, is that oil or?
Oil, yeah, these will all be oil and canvas. I don't think she ever paints with acrylic.
Okay.
It's kind of, I think acrylic probably comes in like probably 1940s, 1950s with plastic. But maybe there's some exceptions with different kind of maybe mediums she's using. Like
Yeah, it almost looks pastel to me.
Yeah, I mean, it could be some exceptions that I don't know about. I agree, there's a kind of texture to this that looks more pastel-y, but it could also be due to the surface she's painting on.
Yeah.
She does play around with different surfaces at kind of her husband's suggestion, and that's really, I mean, imagine being, I can't think of many other famous artist couples. Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo are kind of the, Picasso was kind of just a philanderer, he didn't really have one, wife. Dali and his wife were both pretty creative. I can't remember her name offhand, but what was her name?
Gaia.
Yeah, Gayla. Yeah. So yeah, I think that's a good famous art couple, and so I think she definitely benefits from having all of his kind of talent to rub off on her. But I think in a lot of ways he rightly understood that Frida Kahlo was equal to him, depending on how you kind of evaluate art. Of course, now here she is with Diego Rivera. They definitely look like they're years apart. I think they were about 20 years apart. It definitely kind of looks more further apart here because she looks so young and he looks so kind of old. And also the weight difference, he's a much bigger person, literally towers over her, and he would end up slimming down quite a bit in the United States. And she had a lot of time walking around New York City with her shorter leg, and so it was definitely a time of tension when they come to the United States. But so her work isn't as political as his work. This might be an exception. This is one of her early works, I think showing some of Diego Rivera's influence on her. You'll see that, I guess, after we look at more Diego Rivera. But I like this painting a lot. What do you think this is kind of, what's going on here?
Well, it shows a lot of different people, different kinds of people.
Yeah, and I think it's meant to be like a cross-section of Mexico. She's saying, this is Mexico, everyone's waiting on the, waiting for the bus. And I personally, as someone who's drawn a lot of people in the subway, I think it's great to see like, oh yeah, of course, the subway or the bus is a great way of showing society. And you've got like a traditional woman in the middle, more like Frida Kahlo or her sister on the far right, banker, little kid looking out at everything, mechanic. So I think she's already showing it's like a little portrait of Mexico, and a little bit of hints about her own kind of tension, I think, between the indigenous woman with no shoes on. You probably wouldn't see that in the United States, someone walking around without shoes, for instance, whereas anywhere you go in Guatemala, you see shoes.
It almost looks like that she's holding a baby.
Yeah, I think so. I think that's absolutely, she's holding a baby. And yeah, again, I think that's also her
I
kind
think
of,
she's breastfeeding the baby.
and I think it's showing kind of Mexico
It's
transforming,
like Bayshore.
industrialization. What's that?
Looks like Bayshore Boulevard.
Oh yeah, it does kind of balustrade. Yeah, it does kind of look like Bayshore Boulevard. And this is Diego Rivera's work, so we'll look more at his, so just to kind of contrast. He's painting at this point, he's already been painting murals in a lot of these institutions in Mexico City and beyond, capturing Mexican history, in this case Aztec history probably, and while she's painting much more quiet, smaller paintings like these, or like this, showing this kind of figure nourishing this man above. The equivalent of that from Diego Rivera would be like these two Mexican revolutionaries, probably Emiliano Zapata, the equivalent nourishing the corn. So you can already see there is a kind of symbiosis between, or at least they're mutually influencing each other. But Diego Rivera really goes, he does have a lot of small paintings that he does, but his main thing that he's known for are the murals, the big paintings, where Frida Kahlo's paintings are, very small, if not even smaller. And that's because, she's physically limited, and her whole thing is not, she's not a muralist, she's someone using painting to work through her own relationship and other things. So there they are together. Looks like she's kind of scrutinizing his work and he's scrutinizing her work. And they go to San Francisco by train. Now keep in mind, in 1926, the United States said no more immigrants. No more, from 1926 to 1970 something, the United States kind of closed the borders. And so in the early 1900s, there was eugenics, there was prohibition movement, and a lot of that overlapped with fears about unemployment with 1929, the Great Depression. So while Frida and Kahlo and Diego Rivera are taking the train north, they're passing like thousands of Mexicans who are literally being forcibly repatriated back to Mexico because this is the Great Depression and there was literally, people were going back to Mexico. And so they're kind of, going against the grain and, just kind of setting up that they're aware that they're kind of in this privileged kind of class and they have to kind of, they can't squander their credibility by looking like they're kind of out of touch with the average, Mexican and or being pawns in this bigger game. So that's kind of the nature of Diego Rivera's time in the 1930s in Detroit, San Francisco, and New York, is kind of painting murals that don't kind of make him look like a total sellout. And so that will be what we look at next week. Whereas Frida Kahlo, she's kind of documenting this whole journey from her point of view. And this is one of her more famous paintings. It's very small. It's only like about this big. I think she's actually got a show in New York right now. So if you want to fly up to New York, you can check it out. So what do you see here? Anything religious here? Anything stand out? I don't see much that kind of stands out as she's not like describing the United States as like a religious place, but maybe perhaps she's acknowledging Mexico as a kind of ancient kind of quality. You can see that she's at the border. What's her impression? Which side does she like more? Mexico. Why makes you say she chooses Mexico?
She's holding the flag.
Yeah, the flag. So they got the race car, like a flag on one side, and the cigarette. I think on this side was like another way of kind of like you get the cigarette, you get the flag. A little more space for Mexico. And how does she describe the United States? Now this is probably Detroit, because it says Ford. And that's Ford, the Ford factory. Ford, Edsel Ford, and who was it? Henry Ford. Right, Henry was the one who was, I think, anti-Semitic, and that's kind of, he would go on these kind of tirades against Jewish people, and of course, with Hitler and all that. Frida Kahlo at one point actually asked Henry Ford, "Are you Jewish?" And everyone kind of laughed because they all knew that was sort of like asking Hitler if he's Jewish. Like, nobody would do that except Frida Kahlo, and I think she was well aware that she was doing that. That's her nature, kind of being like saying the one thing that no one would ever say. So, and the dainty pink dress I think is kind of funny. But yeah, I think it really shows this perspective that she has. It looks like a polluted, claustrophobic, kind of loud. There's like two horns there down below. So not a very positive image of the United States, especially if you look at what's going on. This is probably, well, what do you think, what's going on here? What are we looking at here?
Bread lines.
Yeah, bread line, soup line, people waiting for food during the Great Depression. And of course the contrast between that and the background. There's no way like the American way. They used to talk like that. I don't know why they used to talk like that. That was just like the convention and everyone copied it.
And they're
Bob
all
Hope
black
speak.
and that family's white.
But the dog, even the dog, look at that dog, it looks like Falco or something from Never Ending Story. Yeah, they all squeeze in the front seat, I guess. But yeah, interesting. Yeah, the world's highest standard of living. What an interesting photograph. I don't know who photographed this, but well done.
Yeah.
But so this is a really, not the best time to see the United States, So, I think, so she's visiting when we're not necessarily in our best place, not with our best, presentation. But this is such a funny thing to see because she's definitely more famous now than Diego Rivera, or like many people know her as well as they know Diego Rivera. And yet it says, wife of the master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art, which is pretty condescending.
That goes back to this differentiation with the genders. It's like she's not allowed to be her own person. She's somebody's wife.
Right. Now an interesting parallel to this is Georgia O'Keeffe, who's another great artist I really like. And Georgia O'Keeffe, I think, was married to Alfred Stieglitz, and she also struggled with kind of like someone asked her, are you the best female painter in America? She's like, I'm the best painter in America. Kind of thing. It's just, I love it. And and I think it goes back to what you're saying. There's a real kind of tension between like what is to be modern, what is to be traditional, and what is each gender's role in kind of in life, but also in this case art. And it's just so it's almost so wonderful just because this article is so off track with where she would end up as a painter. And it's so funny, even the apron.
And even
What
in
is
like
the date on that?
this is probably right around 1931, when she's in Detroit with her husband, 1932, 1933.
I also love that even in the writing, like the guy is trying to relate in the article her to Diego.
Something about the hilarious incongruity of a stuffed lion, a plaster of Paris horse, and colored chrome of George Washington draped in garlands red, white, and blue, crepe paper, all jumbled in the same shop window, proved to be too much for the sense of humor of Senora Diego Rivera.
Yeah.
I love that they added Senora instead of Mrs.
Instead of her name. And then it's like, she's like, no, I did not study with Diego. I didn't study with anyone. I just started to paint. Like, bro.
He does pretty well for a little boy. But it is I who am the big artist. So yeah, I think you are immediately you're like, I understand, I know who she is, I know what she's like. And she's kind of like, a bold kind of character.
She's like breaking the gender mold in a time that was like really would have been frowned upon.
And I think that you can, and I think you really have to see her work then as kind of like a defiant kind of rejection of those traditions. So here's Henry. This is painted by Diego Rivera, and we'll see his Detroit murals next week, which I need to take a pilgrimage up to Detroit to see because they're really, I think, some of his best work. They were done at the Detroit Auto Center. Get back to that. That's Henry Ford. So while Diego Rivera is going around the Ford Motor Company, and it must have been spectacular to see, these amazing assembly line. Ford was really innovative. He's, to his credit, anti-Semitism aside, he's the guy who kind of developed the idea of, I want my workers to be able to afford the things that they're making, and that's very, articulated economy where the workers can afford. Now, I ask my students, where are all the jobs? They're all in Mexico. So it's like, it's great to have jobs in Mexico, but you also want Mexicans to be able to afford to buy, what is it they make in Puebla, the Volkswagen Bug, a little Bug, which are probably way too expensive to buy in Mexico. So, so it's just, capitalism run amok. But keep in mind, in the 1930s, Diego Rivera was willing to put aside his critique of capitalism because he knew Hitler and fascism were like a greater existential threat. So I think the 1930s had a kind of little bit of a kumbaya kind of, okay, we'll put aside our differences briefly for Hitler, and then of course after 1950 or 1945, all the kumbaya faded away. So this is Frida Kahlo said, Americans have faces like unbaked rolls, which I think it is so funny because it's like, from the perspective of someone in Mexico, where bread making is probably not industrial. Over here, you just used to be able to smell the bread being baked right over here. Remember that? And I could hear my grandmother saying something kind of like this. Whereas kids today probably don't even know what baked bread even looks like. Whereas Frida Kahlo is like, the Americans look like they're don't have as much pigment in their skin. But I think to our credit, he was talking about people in Detroit in the middle of winter, so they probably were, sunbathing at the beach of the Great Lakes yet. Or we'll be Yeah, I think
She's
that's
like,
goes
put 'em
for
back
kind of irreverence. And here's Diego Rivera painting the workers. So his work is very public, very, you don't see a Diego Rivera in the painting, you don't see any writing, you don't see any, there's no personal, there's no anything. It's all public. And he thought it was so funny that Americans would actually go watch on the weekend, they would get dressed up and go watch the workers in the Ford Motor Company make cars. And Diego Rivera said, that's nuts. That's crazy. No Mexican would ever be caught dead. And I'm reading, it's like, that sounds awesome to go watch cars being made in the factory. And again, that goes to show these really subtle cultural differences between Mexico and the United States. And it's really hard to say, one's better than the other. Not that you should need to, but it's because in this case, I think it's neat to watch, cars being made. But don't bring a Mexican friend because they might be like, I'm not gonna watch that. I'd rather do that. But what a cool little, show. And we'll look at more of his Detroit work, which is definitely one of the strongest. And then in contrast, like I said, some of our work is very hard to see. This is what Frida Kahlo is painting. So very different from one to the other. Diego Rivera would probably never paint something like this, and wouldn't really work either. And this is Frida Kahlo kind of making her miscarriage front and center, really, to the point. I don't think she was ever thinking like, that writer who wrote about her would struggle to look at this, because it's not for them. It's for her own, I think her own,
like processing.
well-being, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not for other people, it's for her, because, she's trying to wrestle through the experience. And again, I think you have to go back to the ex voto paintings, which we'll see some examples of in a moment, where she's really kind of using, and I think you can see it, there's kind of a religious quality to this. What about this has a kind of Catholic quality, or religious quality? Anything here kind of feel religious? It looks like some holy someone there, Mother Teresa, the Virgin Mary, kind of overlooking thing, am I right there? With some kind of like spiritual, mentor or guidance. And of course, miscarriage, she loses her child, so she's kind of, and covering up her face. It's very powerful, if not kind of almost disturbing. But so it's really her talking about her own personal life and using painting as a way to navigate through that, which is very different than what Diego Rivera would do, or traditional. And you wouldn't see many painters at this time do this, especially I think in North America. And I think it really goes to show, you could see some Aztec references, mother goddess, religion, birth, blood is certainly central to the Aztec religion. And I think you have to really see that as something that, blood and sacrifice as part of Aztec culture. And so you see that throughout her work. In this case, she's talking about, so she's in the United States, dealing with her miscarriage, reading an article about a guy who murdered his wife back in Mexico with 1,000 little knife stabs. So unos cuantos picaditos is like however many stabbings kind of thing, right? So the blood all over it. So she's kind of taking this news story and kind of personalizing it, identifying with it, connecting with it. And we even want to see the dove that is right. For me, that still feels like kind of folky, Catholic kind of traditional, the doves. So it's almost like and even the blood, there's something about Catholicism and even Christianity with blood and sacrifice and suffering that I think is so important. It's both literally blood and it's expressive. It's kind of expressive.
And really wide blue baseboards on both of those pictures.
Yeah, right? Very interesting. You observe that.
And almost looks like sky, or, I don't know.
And it'll kind of lead,
Unos cuantos piquetitos.
Yeah.
It's like a few little pricks.
yeah, pricks, yeah.
At the time of her art, was she trying all to be marketable? I mean, was it?
Well, so her work was never, so at some point, yeah, she did have a big exhibit, and she sold some of her work, but not as much, I think because her work is so kind of personalized. And that's a tricky thing, yeah, about making, the more personalized you make your artwork, the less maybe marketable it is, unless you die, and then once you die, I think then your value goes way up.
I have a question.
Yes.
On the picture there, the two birds, one is
It's
black
like the
and
dove
one is white.
shadow.
Could it be good and evil?
That seems to make sense, and that she needed to add the other one was an interesting kind of thing for me, because it seems like that first one was given a lot of kind of attention, where the second one was more like, let me just do a silhouette. So maybe she just felt like, yeah, there's some need for some kind of balance. As a shoe for me kind of almost mirrors the bird, the shape, and the color. But great question. I don't know. I think that's what I'm looking for. Little subtle things that almost imply some kind of deus ex machina, some kind of divine intervention, some kind of divine clarity. But I just love the blood on the frame. It's almost like it kind of coming out of the picture,
What
kind
is
of
it called? The
kind of
flying
stains
bed?
you. What's that?
The flying bed is the name of it.
Yeah.
The flying
Yeah, the
bed.
flying bed. Yeah, and that could be reference to the bird you're talking about. The
That's
bed,
what I
fly.
thought.
Yeah.
On the previous one about her birth, the portrait, I had to look it up because I was curious. It's supposed to be Our Lady of Sorrow,
Okay.
which is a term used to represent the Virgin Mary.
Right. Okay.
So it's a Catholic.
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's, she's not, I don't think she has any mean-spiritedness towards Catholicism, but I think for her it'd be really hard to say like, yes, I'm Catholic, because she might feel this like, well, if I say that, then I'm denying my indigenous kind of thing. And
It was also in the painting of her accident. That figure in the corner was also Our Lady of Sorrow in the
okay, yeah, I
text.
think we'll see her again too.
Yeah.
So I think she's definitely finding some kind of like, I think with her case, she'd say there's kind of like a Joseph Campbell kind of picking these different archetypal kind of things.
Why is it called My Birth?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. Well, why do you think?
I don't know.
I don't wanna, I mean, I have an idea about why that
Yeah,
might be.
the only thing I would think of is it changed her so much.
Yeah, I think
Yeah.
it's really her, and this is just one idea, but I think it's her saying her birth is out of the kind of absence of having a real birth. Like her own kind of birth came as a byproduct of not having this.
Yeah, I think that changed her greatly. It looks like she's shrouding herself like that old self is down dead.
Right. Yeah, coming to terms with a kind of new identity based on kind of letting go of what she thought, kind of those expectations. And yeah, absolutely, with the miscarriage comes this question like, will I ever be able to have children? And the answer is no. And she has to come to terms with that. And her painting becomes a deliberate substitute for, in addition to having pets and other things, and a lot of cool things that she includes in her paintings. And she'll be the first to acknowledge that. So this is still her kind of reeling from coming to terms with this, not having a child, how that will impact her relationship with her husband, what that means for her own sense of identity, and I think her own just desire to care for something and have a kind of that traditional kind of experience in life. And so what you're seeing here is this is Detroit in the background. That's Detroit, and not very flattering picture of Detroit, foreground or background, and the bed she's on. And these are different symbols that kind of relate to her miscarriage. The snail is like the slow disintegration of the fetus, and I can't remember what the other things are. The pelvis that was destroyed during the bus accident is probably what contributed. So she's not only dealing with the bus accident still, but also what the implications for that on her own kind of life. And again, this is maybe a little easier to look at than the one with the child, this one, but still the same kind of picture about making her own miscarriage and her own suffering front and center, and the blood, we've seen this in other pictures, the blood connecting, so she's using blood as kind of like a kind of spiritual, metaphysical kind of link to other things.
Like she doesn't have any support or comfort, and it's like that's why it's all.
This is almost microscopic or something.
It's interesting.
The wilted flower.
And she's crying, she's clearly crying, so they kind of, coming undone.
Can be used as symbolism for
Yeah, I think someone might have bought her that flower. I can't remember what the symbolism of that was. But yeah, you can see it says Henry Ford Hospital.
It's like.
I don't know if that's meant to be kind of like snarky or just kind of time stamping it, like you said. So these are some ex voto paintings. So these are the kinds of paintings. These are not by Frida Kahlo. This is a tradition in Mexico of hiring an artist. I can't even see what that is. I think that's in flames, being burned in flames. So I don't know what's specific to that one. But there's a tradition, the Catholic tradition in painting and Catholicism. I'd say the history of art, it cannot be separated from Catholicism or Christianity, because so much of the history of art is using artwork to visualize the Bible. And in this case, they're kind of springing off of that and using artwork to visualize personal suffering and kind of filtering it through a kind of Catholic worldview. So a person wishing to thank a higher power, usually for a miraculous intervention that had saved them from certain death, etc., you hire a local artist. So I don't think we have that in the United States. I mean, maybe there's some exception to that, but we don't really have that ex voto tradition. Now you would just use social media, just like vent, and then it's very different though, right? But it's very different, right? So if you hire an artist to paint your suffering, it's still like a picture you put in your house, and you don't necessarily put it on social media, and it's not the same thing, because if you go on social media and say, oh, I'm suffering, oh, it's like, now people are like, come on, you're going on social media, you need people to hear it. It's really like hard to kind of, it's not the, canvas is not the same as posting on social media, right? Because it's just a different kind of relationship to your own kind of suffering, and in this case, I'm not sure exactly what's going on, but probably someone's bedridden, suffering, and these paintings are all over, you know, this is like richly immersed and richly part of, inseparable from Mexican life and Catholic life. I don't know what's actually going on here, but maybe the father died, and you hire an artist to kind of, to help the family to kind of cope with the aftermath of suffering, or maybe it's something to celebrate because something miraculous. Maybe the Virgin Mary appeared, and you know, I remember growing up here, there was like the Virgin Mary was on a bank, and like the window, and people would still, I don't know if that still happens, but that might be the closest equivalent of people seeing the Virgin Mary in a bowl of soup or something. Oh!
What I think it speaks to, especially in the first painting, when the person was engulfed with flames and shame, I mean, it's amazing the calmness on their face.
Yeah, and I think that's the power of it. And that almost feels like Frida Kahlo, her
Turning
calmness.
faith no matter what you're.
Yeah, and I think that's a really great, because that really does make me think of a lot of her paintings. She's looking directly out at you, and it's almost a way of kind of diminishing the suffering, or kind of being stoic in the face of suffering. So yeah, that's a great observation. Even the flames here remind me of Frida Kahlo, the use of blood, and just the fact that he's not only in shame, but he's being burned alive, and he's totally calm, in spite of the haircut, so.
In spite of the haircut.
I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Yeah, okay, so it's, I think, in the year, blah, 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 having found themselves, shipwreck, I guess. Looks like maybe she made the shipwreck because she's so big. But yeah, the ship is, I guess it's about hired artists to capture your shipwreck, the Virgin Mary intervening and saving your ship. And what was the biblical story about the shipwreck in Galilee, I think we crashed in Galilee and storm in Galilee, something like that. But yeah, I think you can really see that Frida Kahlo is completely using, you know, whether it's the scale or the size, or just kind of something about the folky quality to it. I mean, she's adding a layer, obviously a layer of kind of intellectual sophistication to her work, and of course talent. She's clearly able to kind of draw details. I think this artist isn't quite kind of getting us all involved in, but definitely the kind of using painting to address suffering.
It's like wonderfully simplistic too.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah, and I think that's why her work is so great. She's errs on the side of kind of a clarity. And I think that's to Diego Rivera, you know, we'll look at his work more next week. He errs on the side of clarity too, instead of abstract, and I think that kind of was a positive influence on her, where she had likewise kind of tries to keep it, you know, although she doesn't overwhelm you with subject matter, which is certainly what Jake. In a way, you could say this like the oh, he's going to flood you with subject matter, I'll give you very few things. And he gets home from painting a mural, he sees it, it's like, oh my God, that took you only so little time. Or, you know, he's been, you know, I don't know how much, I get the impression his assistants did a lot of the work. We'll talk more about him next week. So keep in mind, in the 20th century, you know, by the late 20th century, you had a lot better kind of infant mortality, but even in the, you know, going back to 1740s, you know, 1 out of every 3 children died. So, you know, it's much more commonplace, even back, you know, 100 years ago, that children die in childbirth. Today, it's, I think, very uncommon in the United States, not completely out, you know, it does still happen. But so she's kind of in an age where you're kind of not quite yet, you know, penicillin and things like that, but not, you know, and certainly vaccines, you know, eugenics, coming to terms with technology's ability to kind of make life better. That's kind of floating in the background. Now, in this case, this is, again, after her miscarriage, and she's kind of reflecting, literally, I think, on the future. You know, we've all been in the bathtub staring at our toes, and, you know, I think we can relate to the idea that kind of that moment is a time for you to kind of things literally bubble to the surface, your memories, your thoughts. And I think that's what she's doing. She's kind of taking an inventory of her life, her costumes that she wears. You know, she had some bisexual tendencies, her family, kind of taking an inventory, and also kind of an inventory of who she is, her identity, as she stares into the bathtub. And I think, again, that's very personal and private and intimate and very relatable, You gotta love the reflection of the toad.
Coming out of the
But then Diego Rivera, he's painting these murals, these quote-unquote portable murals at the Museum of Modern Art at this point. And this is a big deal. You know, the Museum of Modern Art was founded by the Rockefellers, if I remember correctly. And you know, that's important because literally the Rockefellers were in charge of mending fences with Mexico. That's why Diego Rivera's in the United States in the first place. And he's the second guy to get a solo show at the MoMA right after Matisse. So Matisse, Diego Rivera, so that really, you know, that's like, you know, putting yourself up with this, you know, greats. So these are the murals that he makes at MoMA to basically talk about Mexican history, you know, the conquest, that's probably, you know, enslavement of Mexicans for sugarcane production on the coast. Not a lot of sugarcane in Mexico, we'll have to see more of that in Cuba. This is the Mexican Revolutionary. This is very like, almost like a religious painting, like Christ being rescued from the cross. Emiliano Zapata with his white horse, which he didn't have, he had a black horse. Frida Kahlo criticized him for that. She's like, that horse isn't white. And I guess these are kind of revolutionaries, communists standing up against the government, or something like that. I don't know why I say communist, but usually you see a lot of the, when you see the overalls, that's kind of a stand-in for like mechanic or factory worker. But these are very historical, very, you know, public, very kind of not personal. And so again, the contrast between Diego Rivera, his work, and the work of Frida Kahlo could not be more clear, and yet such an important kind of comparison to see the two. So Diego Rivera goes from Detroit to New York City, where he's supposed to, he does his Museum of Modern Art solo show, and then he gets his commission for the Rockefeller Center. You know, 30 Rock, is that what 30 Rock? Is that 30 Rock is Rockefeller Center? And that's where you've got the Apollo statue, or Prometheus, I think, pointing at the world. And if Diego Rivera were a little less of a principled guy, you could go see his amazing painting, Man at the Crossroads. But you can't see that because it was destroyed, and we'll talk about that next week. And while he's kind of busy painting these pictures in Detroit and New York City, Frida Kahlo is completely miserable, which is too bad. And I think it's partly because it was really hard to walk around with her physical issues. She really missed Mexico, and I really think she just really felt like Mexico, she belonged there with kind of a constellation of people she's used to, family members. I think her mother dies while she's in the United States, and she's just really yearning for Mexico at this point. But I think the picture really captures, when you look at this picture, what do you notice?
He's looking around, and she's just like.
Yeah, I know what he's looking at. He's checking out all the ladies. Trust me, when we do the next class, you'll appreciate why I say that.
I mean, he kind of has that expression on his face too.
Yeah, he's not looking at her.
And she's looking dead at the camera.
Right.
His expression is just like over it.
With the empty ice cream cone.
He's just done.
The empty ice cream cone is like Diego Rivera. Like, okay, I've had enough of this guy. And he has, because at this point he's cheated on her dozens of times with, and you know, I think that's often the case in artist relationships. So, you know, she knew what she was getting into. She knew he was a guy. He literally brought her a doctor's note. The doctor, he said, asked the doctor to write a note that says he cheats, and it's like a disease that he cheats on her. And he literally brought her that note as justification for his cheating. Like, look, the doctor says it's like,
Wow.
I don't know if he got pills.
You want to talk about
pills for that.
differentiation and gender roles?
Right.
Because
Now-
she did that.
Now, she does get paybacks on him in several ways. You can see the content. He's really slimmed down probably from all the work he's doing in the United States. But and here's a painting she does towards the end. Again, I think not a very flattering picture of the United States because this is the time of the Great Depression. And she's got her dress hanging up there, kind of in between a trophy and a toilet. Yeah. Looks like a kind of collage down below, and a lot of things going on. You know, this is a Lindbergh child was kidnapped and killed. That was a big deal. The Jazz Age, you know, there's some great Gatsby's writing. You know, most of the sidewalks here in Tampa were, I see 1926, you know, right? The 1930s. Tampa was kind of in a heyday in the 1920s, 1930s. But it looks like she doesn't really like New York City very much. I think we can agree on that.
How big she gets that much detail, if those are small paintings?
These are very small paintings. Yeah, shockingly small.
Teeny tiny paintbrush.
Yeah, very, yeah.
I don't even know how you do it.
Painting with the knuckles.
Yeah.
It is pretty impressive. But that's definitely collage down below. She's cheating there. It gets really annoying to repeat those windows over and over.
Did she speak English?
What's that?
Did she speak English?
Not as well as probably.
That she could get by?
I think she could get by, but I don't think she probably wrote very much English at all. That's a good question, I should know that, I'm sorry, I know. But I would think probably very few people back then learned English the way, today.
May West.
That would be so funny, because I'd like to hear more of her Spanglish, kind of, like the word Spanglish probably didn't exist back then.
Probably.
That looks like May West on the left.
Yeah, that probably is who she is. I don't know Mae West as to recognize her, but probably from films at
Probably
this time.
contemporary.
Yeah, yeah. And keep in mind, we'll be learning a little bit about Hitler when we get to Cuba. I think a segue from kind of Mexico to Cuba, we have to kind of address Hitler, because Hitler and art is a really important phenomenon in the 20th century. And a lot of this is kind of careening towards, Hitler's own issues and what artists do to react to that. But here she is, I think, back at this point, either back in Mexico or almost back. And for me, when I see this, I'm like, she's affirming, she's like, I'm not dyeing my mustache. Again, she's been in the United States where people look very different. I think this is her affirming her own uniqueness on her, way back to Mexico or back in Mexico, which is cool.
I guess that's the thing.
And there she is with Jagger back in Mexico. They left New York. His mural was destroyed. A lot of his other commissions dried up because of the controversy with the Rockefeller Commission. And they go back to Mexico, and you think, oh, this is probably a great recipe for them to finally come back and fall back in love and happily ever after. Nothing could go wrong, right? And he goes back to repainting his murals, finishing up some of the ones he started, which we'll look at next week. And he always puts Frida Kahlo in the paintings. And here's the house that they build with some of the money he made. She's got her blue side, that's her little side. That's his side, I guess that's a little love bridge, a little love bell that they push there. Hello. And you'd think this is a recipe for everything to go happily ever after, right? Unfortunately, he has an affair with her sister. So in 1935, Diego cheats on Frida Kahlo. It's one thing to cheat on someone maybe with like some other person, but with a family member, you gotta wonder. Here's Christina. So she was divorced, she has her own children, which maybe adds insult to agony. And you gotta wonder at this point, like, so was he sabotaging the relationship? Was he literally trying to just be like, let me do something so bad?
I mean,
So-
more shame on her sister more than him.
Yeah, absolutely. A lot of that brush could be spread around
Since
for
he had a
sure.
medical condition.
What's that?
It's really common, since he had a medical condition.
Yeah, he had a medical condition, good point. He did have a medical condition, so he did warn them. This relationship would continue on, I think, to the end of Frida Kahlo's life, and probably a source of a lot of strain. And that's why paintings like this, she's painting around this time, because what do you do with all this, a lot of suffering, a lot of uncertainty.
I can't even imagine like the betrayal that she felt from because he already had the pattern built, but then for her sister to also betray her,
Yeah.
like that adds a layer.
And and to take away that kind of family comfort in the face of all this other suffering, now they don't have that anymore either. So it really kind of pulls the rug out. And I think fittingly, she paints herself as kind of a deer, kind of somewhat pagan, I guess, perhaps, but I still think I see more like a Christian kind of reference to this. What am I referring to here?
Crucifixion.
What's that? Crucifixion, and or like who's it? Saint Sebastian, who's the one with the arrows? Something about like suffering and pain and blood. What it reminds me of? You remember Invasion? Do you remember Invasion of
It's
the
like a
Body
thunderstorm.
Snatchers? The original
It's
kind of dog.
a thunderstorm.
Oh,
There's little yellow, really teeny tiny yellow lines.
It's a little dog with a guy's head on it. It's like one Invasion of the Body Snatchers hadn't fully. There's a scene with like a little dog with a person's head on it.
Is that Invasion of Mars?
Sorry you brought it up.
Okay.
But if you watch the old Invasion of the Body Snatchers, in a weird moment, there's a little dog with a person's head on it. That's what this always reminds me of.
I tuned
Anyways.
in at the wrong time.
Yeah. But that's a scary movie. Oh, the screaming they do is really scary.
I was just staring at the like skeletal shape on the tree there.
Oh yeah, they're on the right?
Yeah.
That's interesting, I didn't notice that. And where we're looking, she says in a wood, like a very kind of, not a very happy, forest setting, very ominous,
The
storm.
on the horizon.
Yeah, near the threshold between the ocean and the sea. You see that here. And here she's, I think, going back to her roots with her family. When it comes to like trauma or, relationship trauma, you're gonna kind of rediscover your roots perhaps. And you see the blood acting like kind of family line.
The sperm and
The home, her childhood home, that's her mother and father, grandparents on either side. And here she is, with a little substitute for a child, and, still using painting to really kind of as like a way to hold herself together is a paint, this is actually by one of her early boyfriends, who's kind of frequently throughout her life. It's very interesting to compare photographs or paintings, because they are it's the same subject, but totally different thing. So here's a rare case with her hair down. So this is all reeling from her husband cheating on her with her sister. It feels like here she's, her heart's been kind of punctured. Here she's right on the border between, the ocean.
And she doesn't have her hands.
Yeah, no hand and no, blue, white outfit, blank canvas between like childhood and kind of the outfit she wore for her husband. And that was interesting thinking, well, what do you think? I asked my students about this, and so here she is painting Diego, looking pretty young and maybe probably more flattering than you might expect from someone who's been betrayed by him. So what's she doing here? Why painting? I don't usually paint my exes. Unless it's like a mustache on them, and like a few darts in their face.
She also put him on such a bland, like, backdrop as compared to her portrait that had all that vibrancy.
Yeah.
And then his is just like corporate.
So what's going on here? Why did she paint him?
To show how boring he is.
Maybe. I see this as like, I've known people who when you were going through a breakup, it's like, let me make a list of the positives and make a list of the negatives.
And this is like a painted negative.
Yeah, or like, I don't know, this could be a positive or a negative. I'm almost like, let me make an inventory of this guy.
Almost was like a funeral portrait.
Or funeral portrait, that's good, yeah. So yeah, let me paint him and then burn it kind of thing, or just be done with him. Yeah, no, I think very interesting to think about why. Because think about the dilemma she's facing at this point is, do I stay with him or do I leave him? And he kind of put her into a really unfair position to have to decide. And it kind of mirrors this Bolshevik schism, this kind of, we're very fast approaching the end. In the 1930s, you've got the schism between Trotsky and Stalin. The Soviet Union is a big thing at this point, and Trotsky's kind of more of like the guerrilla revolutionary from the grassroots, where Stalin is like the authoritarian lead from the top. And here is Trotsky with Diego Rivera and with Siqueiros, another artist we'll learn about later. And Trotsky's at this point an exile on the run from Stalin, who's basically got a fatwa against Trotsky to kill Trotsky, and he finds refuge in the home of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Not necessarily a great time to be in the home of Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And here's Trotsky and his wife, who is also not happy, it's probably not a good time for them to be there either. Trotsky on the right with pretty amazing hair. Looks like he's been hit by lightning and
Einstein.
Hair wire. It looks like Marty, great Scott! Frida Kahlo, and there's Mrs. Trotsky, Senora Trotsky. And so this is a painting that Frida Kahlo gives to Trotsky after cheating on Diego Rivera with Trotsky. So that's her paybacks. I think this painting is her paybacks. I'm sure she showed this to Trotsky right in front of Diego Rivera. Oh, hey, here you go, Trotsky, here you go. And she's wearing the outfit that was Diego Rivera's, the outfit she wore to please Diego Rivera. So this is her, I think, kind of getting a kind of petty paybacks. I don't know what it says. You can look that up. That would be very interesting to see what it says on the little writing there. You have to be literate to really understand Frida Kahlo for sure. But yeah, that's, I think, paybacks against Diego. And, a lot of her paintings throughout this time are really kind of her and that mature level. This is her being breastfed by her. A lot of women in Mexico would hire an indigenous woman to breastfeed you. Okay, so you got what it says?
It's a love letter. Okay. For Leon Trotsky, with all my love, I dedicate this painting on November 7th, 1937, signed Frida Kahlo in San Angel, Mexico.
Mm-hmm. Right, and of course, Diego Rivera, the point is it doesn't say Diego Rivera, I'm sure it was
no.
Yeah, and they're all living together at this point, so, a lot of
that's not awkward at all.
A lot of strain. So this is like an indigenous woman midwife and breastfeeding, Frida Kahlo. Again, you see she's really transformed here with the background offering this kind of dreamlike, surreal quality. Tears are everywhere. The tears and the milk, nourished by tears is kind of the message here. And this is when she paints her famous To Frida. So now you really can understand, we're not necessarily looking at a painting of her about addressing Mexico so much as Diego Rivera, her trying to decide, who is she without Diego Rivera? Does she affirm her kind of indigenous side or this? And, she's so inseparable from Diego Rivera in terms of her identity right now. You can really see what a challenge it is kind of separate and still feel like you're a whole person without him. And so she's cutting, the scissors are cutting, we've seen her cutting her hair, now she's cutting the ties with her other sense of self.
What is she holding?
Oh, she's holding a little
side.
picture of Diego Rivera, I think, there's a little picture of him in there. Yes,
I noticed it the first time we went around, the differences in her heart. They're definitely different, and
like
the
anatomy.
one that's on the more traditional, not indigenous, but the other, it's like it's being ripped apart, whereas it's more solid in her indigenous.
Yeah, great observation, you're talking about, it's like we see a cross section here, or something with, and
like
it's whole
being
here.
ripped. And then there's a lot of other ones that we've gone through, especially after the miscarriage, where her heart is laying on the ground.
Yeah.
Her heart
Yeah,
is
you saw
somewhere
that.
else, and,
Like here.
I just thought how broken she was.
Yeah.
Probably by her miscarriage.
Yeah,
And then
miscarriage,
The infidelity.
the infidelity, the sister, right, and on top of that, she got that other background, so yeah, not being able to have a child, not knowing, what, and so that's really, what is this guy's place in that? And I think what she basically, we'll get there in a moment, but I think she basically has to decide, I can rely on him financially maybe, but not emotionally kind of thing, which is not a very, kind of a tragic kind of resolution. So here I think you can see some obvious Christian references here, the crown of thorns around her neck. But now she's really, this is kind of front and center looking straight out at you. And I think it's kind of like what you were saying with the ex voto painting, that's just so stoic in the face of suffering.
She swapped out the dove for a blackbird too.
Right, she swapped out the dove for a blackbird.
But she still has the butterflies.
Yeah, she's got some kind of butterfly, dragonfly. And her painting, look at how much her painting, the rich colors, the lighting. It's really, even Diego Rivera, we'll see this with his murals, if you're not painting from life, your paintings sometimes will look like they're not directly from life, whereas all of her paintings are her looking at herself either in a mirror or maybe in a photograph in some cases, but for me it looks like she's really looking at sunlight falling on her face, and I just think she's reached a level of maturity here, and stuff like this are really, very, I think, capturing what we're talking about. Her broken column, by the way, I didn't even notice, I think that YouTube censors out nipples, so that's why that band is there. I didn't even notice because it matches the corset. So I'm sure the original one has her nipples and all that, but that's just to prevent censoring.
Given the anatomy that we've seen, probably.
Yeah.
I found it interesting on the other portrait too, how her original self-portrait, she did the same thing with the greenery in the background, but she was wearing black.
Interesting.
And this time she moved the black into the background, like with the animals, and she's wearing white.
Right, yeah, so I think she's really embracing that white as kind of like a
Rebirth.
yeah, rebirth, kind of something, go back to some kind of tabula rasa. Now, in terms of, we're 1 year before World War II here, or maybe World War II, kind of 1939 invasion of Poland. Technically, when does World War II start? I don't know. Technically, when it started, I think.
US is 41.
Okay, 41, yeah, so, sorry, I meant the year before the end of World War II. So World War II, I think, ends in 45, around then, right? So here, you really have to, when I show this to my students, I really make a point to say that Frida Kahlo, when you think about her work in the 20th century, this is such it's a painful piece of work, but it's really affirming something so fundamental about our humanity, diversity or uniqueness, physical pain, suffering, and all of us having that going on the inside. And if you contrast that with what's going on in Hitler's Germany, it's all about conformity, it's all about looking the same, no one who the disability would be welcome, you have to doing the same thing, looking the same way, everyone's the same. The other side of that, of course, is the male version of that is everyone got this kind of conformity. And I think Frida Kahlo is really important because she's such a contrast, an antidote to that kind of conformity. And so that's why I think her work is so powerful, because even though some people might look at her work and say, oh, she's just like obsessed with herself. And when you learn about her story, you realize it's not about her being kind of a narcissist. It's about her using her image as a way to keep herself together in the face of everything kind of falling apart. And yeah, here I think the black is almost like she's set on the black after the white.
Yeah.
From white to black. And I was kind of rushed. This is not a Frida Kahlo painting. This is a painting from a generation before her, but it almost shows you some of the tension in Mexico between kind of more indigenous and more European, and two little black and white dogs fighting each other. I think that's almost like a little kind of reference. It almost looks like a soap opera here or something. But almost like a Frida Kahlo painting, kind of broken into pieces, and she brought it all together into one. It looks like, I always like, she's like looking
No,
at
the
fight.
husband's like holding her back.
Yeah, holding her back. You're about to jump over that table, and
Like,
there's gonna be
honey, no.
fruit everywhere. There's gonna be guavas everywhere. And so here she is in front of her painting. And I'm just going to go through some of her older the paintings from this period. They collected a lot of artifacts, Diego Rivera, and she had just a museum basically full of artifacts that they literally dug out of the ground. So that really is a celebration of Aztec history, and holding her little idol there. I don't want to spend too much time on this, just trying to show you kind of how her work we get to this, where this is right before she decides that she's going to get back together. She decides to get back together with Diego Rivera, right around the time when he's painting this mural. And you often see Frida Kahlo in the mural. There she is.
Oh, there
right?
she is?
Yeah, there she is. And that's his way of saying, please, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for cheating on you. I painted you in the mural. Look. And he gave her a little, paintbrush there. It was kind of so condescending, I think, with her little mural there.
But she gave him the little ones too.
Yeah,
And
yes.
it's
I
like
think
they're each other.
it's always like come full circle.
Yeah.
Now, when we look at Diego Rivera, you're going to see things like this big monument there in the middle. That's him referencing, Aztec sculpture. So he's kind of channeling Aztec sculpture into industrial America, which is just almost like wow. Yeah, it really is wild. That's the right reaction. Just like two things that were never. I mean, what's so neat is something like this was actually brought to the MoMA and put in the backyard at the MoMA for many months while the exhibition was going on. Imagine like the Aztec gods thinking they're gonna get a trip to the MoMA, the courtyard of MoMA. It's wild. It's like Jesus in the middle of like, I don't know, Mecca or something. It's like weird. It's a place that God doesn't, you would not expect them to find them there. But yeah, there's Frida Kahlo. I think this is really Diego Rivera and her, he's painting her because he's trying to really kind of say, I'm sorry, let me, celebrate you. And here she is there in the background. So she must have decided to, stay with him, and she does. And they don't last much longer than this. We'll talk about that more when we get to Diego Rivera. But I just want to kind of point out, when I see Frida Kahlo, she's really, when you think of painting, traditional painting, you're not really looking directly at a person. There's some cases, but that's kind of comes from photography. Traditional painting is kind of like a window, and I'm looking at stuff going on, and they're not necessarily looking at you. There's some exceptions, but definitely with photography, you really get this kind of breaking the fourth wall, like I'm looking directly out at you, the audience. And I think that's what makes her work so kind of, even here, they're kind of looking away. There's no kind of necessarily like looking directly at you. And now there are some exceptions to that. But I think you see that like here with Jesus looking directly. And that's why we talk about this being like Protestant Jesus. He's reaching directly out to you and not, looking up to the church or to God. He's got this great direct connection to you. You see that with the Mona Lisa in a way. She's kind of looking away, but there's something really, I think, relatable about her because she's connecting to you. She's kind of reaching across that void. Albrecht Dürer doing the same thing, really kind of acknowledging the self. But in his case, it's more like, oh, look at how awesome I am, look at my beautiful hair, look at my awesome clothing. Whereas Frida Kahlo, it's the kind of the same thing, but it's so different because it's all about her suffering and about her pain, and she's making her pictures to really kind of keep herself together and to hide a lot of, or to cope with anxiety. Maybe similar to this. This is more like Frida Kahlo, someone who's kind of suffering, but you can almost feel it in the back. Or like the Scream. I think Frida Kahlo work is kind of like the Scream in some ways. Just trying, and of course, bystander effect. Someone's going to do something, and I'm not going to do it. Well, because someone else is going to do something to help this person. I feel like almost her painting's almost like her kind of reaching out to you. There's something about that. I don't know what it is about the bystander effect. There's something about her breaking that fourth wall that feels like she's just really reaching out to you to connect and relate. You can relate to her suffering. Yeah, she must have had a noisy house. So anyway, I think that's a good place to end because we're going to be looking at her work to a degree when we look at Diego Rivera. But next week when we look at Diego Rivera, we're really going to be looking at the Mexican Revolution and then talk about kind of what's going on in the United States and think about, well, what is his relationship to faith? And I think you'll find that it's a little trickier with him because her work is so personal that it's almost like she has this personal connection to some kind of, wanting a higher power. But, when we shift to murals and big historical things, it's a very different kind of animal. So, but I think we'll still want to ask, like, why is it when Diego Rivera finally paints this big mural in New York City, you know, he kind of has this kind of Jesus Christ-like figure, and so you kind of, we'll think about why that is when we talk about that next week. So I guess I'll see you guys then. Have a great day.
Thank you.